The man who would later vanish from memory entirely arrived in the capital on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying nothing but a leather case and a name no one would later agree upon. He took a room above a printer's shop where the ink smell never left the floorboards. Within a week, he had convinced 3 separate investors that he possessed exclusive rights to a mining operation that existed only in the grammar of his sentences. The money came first as a trickle, then as a flood. He never raised his voice. He never promised miracles. He simply described what already was, in a place that wasn't, with a certainty that made doubt feel like rudeness. His method was not deception in any traditional sense. He did not forge documents or invent elaborate histories. Instead, he spoke about ventures with the tedious specificity of someone bored by his own success. When pressed for proof, he would sigh and produce a letter. Always genuine, always from someone respectable, always about something adjacent to the claim but never quite confirming it. The listener would fill the gap themselves. He understood that people do not believe what they are told. They believe what they construct from fragments, and they defend those constructions fiercely because they have authored them. By summer, he had an office with 2 clerks and a waiting room where men in good coats sat for hours hoping to be seen. He held court 3 days a week, turning away more opportunities than he accepted. Scarcity became his currency. The mining venture led to a shipping concern, which led to a textile speculation, which led to a railway proposal that would connect 2 cities that barely needed connecting. Each enterprise existed in documents, in contracts, in the shared hallucination of men who had already spent the profits in their minds. He married in autumn. The woman was a merchant's daughter with a plain face and an excellent education she had never been allowed to use. She knew what he was within a month. She said nothing. At night, he would sit by the window in their narrow house and stare at the street below, and she would watch him from the bed. And the silence between them was not peaceful but structural, like the silence inside a bridge. She bore him a daughter the following spring. He held the child once, with the careful distance of a man handling a borrowed thing, and then returned her to the nurse. The first collapse came in the form of a letter he did not open. It sat on his desk for 3 days while he conducted meetings in the next room, his voice steady, his hands still. When he finally read it, alone, after midnight, the contents were unremarkable. A partner in the textile concern had traveled to the supposed factory and found an empty warehouse. Not even a loom, just pigeons and the smell of old rain. The man did not panic. He drafted 7 letters before dawn, each one redirecting inquiry, redistributing blame, reconstructing narrative. 6 of them worked. But something had shifted in the architecture of his attention. He began to notice the way his clerks watched him, the half-second delay before they nodded at his instructions. His wife stopped asking about his day. His daughter learned to walk while he was in a meeting that never happened, discussing profits that had never existed, with men whose faith was already curdling into suspicion. At night, the street below his window seemed darker than it had been, and he could not say if the city had changed or if he had simply stopped believing in the light. The second year of his prominence was the year of his greatest expansion and his first genuine terror. He had learned that the moment before collapse is indistinguishable from the moment before triumph, and so he moved faster, spoke louder, signed his name on documents he no longer read. A banking consortium approached him about consolidating his ventures under a single institutional umbrella. The meeting took place in a room with oil paintings of men who had been dead for a century. He sat across from 3 financiers who spoke in the careful language of people who have already decided but want to appear thoughtful. He should have declined. The smart move was to remain diffuse, to keep each illusion separate so that the failure of one would not contaminate the others. But he was tired. The maintenance of multiple fictions required a cognitive load he had not anticipated. Each lie demanded a dozen supporting lies, and those demanded dozens more, until his mind was a filing system he could barely navigate. The banking offer was a simplification, a single grand fiction that would require less upkeep. He accepted with a handshake that felt like surrender. The consolidation required an audit, not a deep one. These men were not suspicious, merely procedural. But procedural was enough. He spent 6 weeks fabricating records, bribing clerks, forging signatures on letters from dead men. His wife found him asleep at his desk one morning, his face pressed against a ledger, ink smeared across his cheek like a bruise. She cleaned him without comment and sent the children away for the day. He did not thank her. He barely saw her. The audit concluded with minor discrepancies that were explained away as clerical errors. The bankers nodded and moved forward, but the man knew. He had seen the moment when one of them, the youngest, had paused over a shipping manifest that listed cargo that had never been loaded onto ships that had never sailed. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. The young banker said nothing. The consolidation proceeded, but that pause lived in the man's chest now, a small stone he could not cough up. His daughter turned 3. He attended her birthday, stood in the corner of the drawing room while children shrieked, and his wife managed the chaos with the efficiency of someone fighting a fire alone. A colleague approached him, congratulated him on his recent successes, mentioned casually that he had a brother-in-law looking to invest. The man heard himself agree to a meeting. His voice came from somewhere else, some older version of himself that still believed in the sustainability of the performance. That night, he did not go home. He walked the streets until the lamplighters began their rounds, and then he walked in the dark they left behind. He passed the printer's shop where he had first taken a room, and the building looked smaller than he remembered, as if memory had been generous in a way reality was not. He thought about his daughter, about the way she had looked at him during the party, not with love or even recognition, but with the polite curiosity one might direct at a stranger who has wandered into the wrong house. He thought about that until the thinking became unbearable, and then he thought about money instead, because money was simpler. The third year brought a war in a country most people could not locate on a map, and the war brought speculation, and speculation brought him more money than he had ever imagined. Not real money, money that existed in the gap between promise and delivery, in contracts for goods that would be needed in 6 months, in ships that would sail in the spring, in factories that would triple production as soon as the proper machinery arrived from the continent. He had stumbled into legitimacy by accident. Some of his ventures, the ones he had nearly forgotten, had become accidentally real through the efforts of other people who believed in them more than he did. This should have been relief. Instead, it was vertigo. He had built his life on the premise that everything was false, and now pieces of the false were becoming true without his permission, and he no longer knew which was which. A factory he had invented was now producing textiles because an investor had hired a manager who did not know the factory was supposed to be fictional. A shipping route he had described in a single drunken meeting was now operational because someone else had seen the potential and made it happen. He was becoming successful despite himself, or perhaps because of himself, in ways he could not control. His wife was pregnant again. He learned this from the housekeeper. When he asked his wife why she had not told him herself, she looked at him with an expression he could not read and said she had assumed he knew. The baby came in winter, a boy this time, and the man held him with the same careful distance he had shown the daughter. But the boy did not look away. The boy stared at him with dark, unfocused eyes that seemed to see past the performance into whatever remained underneath. The man handed him back to the nurse and left the room. The banking consortium wanted to celebrate his successes with a dinner. 40 men in a hall with chandeliers, speeches about vision and progress, toasts to the future. He stood and delivered remarks he had not prepared, and the words came easily because they meant nothing. Afterward, the young banker, the one who had paused over the shipping manifest, approached him with a glass of wine and a strange smile. They spoke about nothing for 10 minutes. As the banker walked away, he said over his shoulder, almost as an afterthought, that he admired the man's ability to make people believe. The tone was impossible to parse. It might have been admiration. It might have been a threat. It might have been both. He began drinking in the mornings, not heavily, just enough to smooth the edges of the day into something manageable. His clerks noticed but said nothing. His wife noticed and said less than nothing. Her silence was not absence but presence, a watchfulness that felt like judgment even when her face showed none. He started taking longer routes to the office, walking through parts of the city he did not know, streets where no one recognized him and his name meant nothing. In those neighborhoods, he felt something close to peace, or at least something close to the absence of dread. One afternoon, returning from such a walk, he found a man waiting in his office. Not an investor or a colleague, but someone shabbier, hungrier. The man claimed to be a journalist. He had questions about the mining concern, about the dates certain claims had been filed, about the correspondence between those dates and the dates of certain investments. The man who had built everything from nothing felt the nothing reassert itself, patient and inevitable. He answered the questions with the same calm he had always used, but his hands, hidden beneath the desk, were shaking. The journalist left satisfied, or at least pretending to be. The man sat alone in his office until the clerks went home, and then he sat in the dark. The journalist's article appeared in a smaller publication, the kind read by people who considered themselves informed but lacked the capital to matter. The piece was careful, filled with questions rather than accusations, but the questions were arranged in a way that suggested answers. The man read it 3 times, parsing each sentence for legal vulnerability, and found none. But legal safety was not the same as social safety. Doubt, once introduced, spreads through networks of trust like water through cracked stone. 2 investors withdrew quietly, citing other opportunities. A third sent a letter requesting a meeting to clarify certain timelines. The man scheduled the meeting for 3 weeks out, hoping the journalist would publish something else, that the attention would move on. But the journalist did not move on. A second article appeared, this one focused on the shipping concern, complete with interviews from dock workers who could not recall ever loading the cargo described in the company's records. The workers were probably lying. People lied for money all the time, but proving that required a level of engagement the man could not afford. His wife asked him finally if they were in danger. He was in his study, staring at a contract he could no longer remember signing. She stood in the doorway, her hands folded across her stomach. She was showing now visibly a pregnancy he kept forgetting existed. He told her they were fine. She asked again. He repeated himself. She stood there for a long moment, and then she said something that shattered the careful distance they had maintained. I know what you are, and I have known from the beginning, and I stayed because I thought you were at least competent. Then she left, and he sat in the study until the candles burned down. The young banker requested a private meeting. They met in a coffee house near the river, a place too public for conspiracy, but too loud for anyone to overhear. The banker did not waste time. He explained that the consortium had concerns, not about the ventures themselves, those were performing adequately, but about the optics of the journalism, about the risk to the consortium's reputation. The man nodded, agreeing to everything, promising transparency, offering to open his books to further scrutiny. The banker listened politely and then said almost gently that perhaps the man should consider stepping back from the more visible aspects of the business, not resigning, nothing so dramatic, but allowing others to take the public role while he worked behind the scenes. The man agreed to this too, because what else could he do? Stepping back was supposed to be a relief. Instead, it was erasure. Within a month, his name appeared on fewer documents. Within 2 months, meetings were scheduled without his knowledge. His clerks began reporting to someone else, a younger man with confidence that had not yet been tested by failure. The man still came to the office, but the office no longer needed him. He would sit at his desk, shuffling papers that no longer mattered, while the enterprise he had invented hummed around him, functioning better without his participation. He started spending afternoons in the public library, a vast marble building where silence was enforced and anonymity was easy. He would sit in the reading room with a book he was not reading, watching people come and go, marveling at the simple fact of their purposefulness. They knew what they wanted. They moved through the world with the assumption that their actions would lead to predictable outcomes. He envied them in a way that felt almost physical, a hunger for the ordinary faith he had never possessed. Sometimes he would sit there until the library closed, and then he would walk home slowly, delaying the moment when he would have to open his own door. The baby was born in early spring, during a week of rain that turned the streets to mud. The man was not present for the birth. He was in a meeting that had been scheduled over the delivery date, and he attended because attending was easier than explaining why he would not. When he returned home, the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. His wife was upstairs, asleep or pretending to be. The baby was with the nurse. His daughter was in the parlor, drawing with chalk on a slate. She did not look up when he entered. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time, trying to summon some feeling that matched the moment, but all he felt was tired. The journalist published a third article, this one more aggressive. It named names, including his, and used words like fabrication and misrepresentation, without the protective cushion of questions. The man read it in his office, not his old office, but a smaller one they had moved him to, a room without windows that smelled like damp paper. His first instinct was to respond, to draft a letter to the editor, to demand a retraction, but he knew how that would look. Defense confirmed guilt in the eyes of people who had already decided to doubt. So he did nothing, and the nothing felt like drowning. His wife stopped speaking to him entirely. Not out of anger. Anger would have been easier, but out of something closer to indifference. She managed the household, raised the children, received visitors, all without requiring his input or acknowledging his presence. They existed in the same house like tenants in adjacent rooms, aware of each other only through the sounds that leaked through walls. He thought about apologizing, but he could not identify what specifically he would be apologizing for. The lies, the marriage itself, the children, the fact that he was still there taking up space when someone better might have occupied it. The consortium held a meeting without him. He learned about it from his former clerk, who mentioned it in passing, assuming the man already knew. The meeting had been about restructuring, about separating the functional ventures from the questionable ones, about protecting the institution from association with anything that might later prove embarrassing. The man's name had been discussed, the clerk said, though he did not specify in what context. The clerk seemed uncomfortable delivering this information, as if he were informing someone of a death they should have already heard about. The man began taking longer walks, this time out of the city entirely, into the countryside where the roads were unpaved and the houses were separated by fields. He would walk for hours, sometimes until dark, returning home exhausted and covered in dust. His wife said nothing about these absences. His daughter asked once where he went, and he told her he was thinking. She accepted this without follow-up, as if thinking were a place one could visit, a destination like any other. He wondered what she would remember about him when she was older. Probably nothing. Probably he would be a gap in her history, a shape that failed to form. One evening, returning from one of these walks, he encountered the young banker on the street near his house. The meeting was not accidental. The banker had been waiting. They walked together in silence for a while before the banker spoke. He said that the consortium had made a decision. The man would be formally separated from the business. Not publicly. There would be no announcement, no scandal. But his name would be removed from all documents. His shares would be bought out at a fair price, and he would be expected to maintain silence about the separation. The banker delivered this with kindness, or at least with the performance of kindness. The man agreed to everything. He felt nothing. Perhaps that was the same as relief. The money from the buyout was substantial, enough to live comfortably for years without working. He placed it in a bank, a different bank, one that had no knowledge of his history, and tried to imagine what one did with comfort. His wife received the news with a single nod. The children did not notice the change. The household continued to function exactly as it had, except now there was no reason for him to leave in the mornings. So he stopped leaving. He would spend entire days in his study, reading newspapers from other cities, tracking stories that had nothing to do with him, people whose failures and successes would never intersect with his own. His daughter turned 5. They held a party, smaller than the previous ones, attended mostly by the children of his wife's friends. The man stood in the garden, watching through the window as the children played. A colleague from his former life, someone who had not been informed of the separation, approached him and asked how business was going. The man said it was going well. The colleague nodded and mentioned that he was planning an investment in a railway expansion. Did the man have any thoughts? The man excused himself and went upstairs. He sat on the edge of his bed until the guests left. The journalist published a longer piece, almost a pamphlet, tracing what he called the architecture of persuasion in modern finance. The man was featured prominently, though not by name. He was described as a figure whose identity has been carefully obscured by those who once celebrated his vision. The piece was not widely read, but it circulated among people who mattered. The man received 3 letters, all polite, all from former associates, all explaining why they could no longer maintain the friendship. He did not respond. He burned the letters in the fireplace and watched the paper curl and blacken. His son learned to walk. The man was in the room when it happened, sitting in a chair by the window, staring at nothing. The boy took 3 wobbling steps from the nurse to his mother, and everyone applauded except the man, who did not notice until the applause had ended. His wife looked at him then, really looked at him, and her expression was not anger or disappointment, but something worse, pity. He left the room. He walked to the public library, but it was closed. He walked past it, into neighborhoods he had never seen, until he could not remember how to get back. A constable found him near midnight, sitting on a bench near the river, and asked if he needed help. The man said no. The constable waited until the man stood and began walking in a direction that looked purposeful, and then the constable left him alone. Autumn came with early cold. The man stopped attending meals with his family. His wife would leave a tray outside his study door, and he would eat mechanically, not tasting the food, and leave the tray where she had placed it. Sometimes he would hear his children playing in other parts of the house, their voices bright and unconcerned, and he would feel something close to gratitude that they existed in a world that did not include him. He was becoming a ghost in his own home, and the transition felt almost natural, as if he had been preparing for it his entire life. One morning he woke to find his wife packing. Not leaving. She would not leave. She had nowhere to go and too much pride to return to her father's house, but moving his things out of their shared bedroom into a smaller room at the back of the house, a room that had been used for storage. She did this without explanation or discussion. He helped her carry his belongings, and they worked in silence. And when it was done, she closed the door between them, and he stood in his new room, surrounded by boxes and dust, and felt something like peace. Or perhaps it was just exhaustion so profound it resembled peace. He could no longer tell the difference. The 4th year was the year he stopped being anyone. He rarely left his room except to walk at night when the streets were empty and the possibility of recognition was minimal. He grew a beard that came in gray and unkempt. His clothes, which had once been tailored and sharp, became shapeless and worn. He looked like what he was, a man who had stopped participating in the world and was waiting for the world to stop noticing him. The waiting did not take long. Within months, people forgot his name. Within a year, people forgot there had been a name to forget. His wife managed everything. She took control of the household finances, made decisions about the children's education, attended social functions alone, and explained his absence with vague references to health concerns. The lie was accepted because it was convenient. People preferred simple narratives, illness, misfortune, bad luck, to the more complicated truth that some men simply vanish from themselves while still occupying space. His daughter started school. His son began speaking in full sentences. The man learned these facts from the housekeeper, who still brought him tea in the afternoons and treated him with the gentle condescension one might show a very old dog. He began writing, not for publication. He would never publish anything again, but for the same reason people write letters they will never send, to organize the chaos, to give shape to the formless. He filled notebook after notebook with accounts of his ventures, not as apologies or confessions, but as technical descriptions, almost clinical in their detachment. He wrote about the methods he had used, the psychological principles he had exploited, the ways trust could be manufactured and maintained. He wrote without judgment, as if he were describing the behavior of insects or the mechanics of a clock. The notebooks accumulated in a drawer in his room. No one would ever read them. He did not write them to be read. One night, he encountered the young banker again. Not by accident this time. The man had sought him out, walking to a coffee house where he knew the banker spent his evenings. The banker seemed unsurprised to see him. They sat at a table in the back, and the man asked a question he had been preparing for months. Did the banker know from the beginning what he was? The banker took a long time to answer. Finally, he said that knowledge and certainty were different things, and that he had suspected many things but proven none, and that in the end it had not mattered because the ventures had worked, more or less, and working was all that markets required. The man thanked him. The banker asked what he planned to do now. The man said he did not know. The banker nodded, as if this were the most reasonable answer possible, and they parted without another word. His wife became pregnant again. He learned this from the doctor, who visited the house for reasons unrelated and mentioned it in passing, assuming the man already knew. The man felt nothing. The pregnancy proceeded without his involvement. His wife moved through the house like a woman managing a business in which he was a minor shareholder, necessary for legal reasons but irrelevant to operations. The baby, when it came, was another girl. The man was informed but did not visit the nursery. He sent no gifts. He wrote no letters of congratulation. He simply continued his routine of waking, sitting, walking, sleeping, as if the addition of another life to the household were no more significant than the arrival of a new piece of furniture. The journalist died. The man read about it in a newspaper. A stroke, sudden, at the age of 43. The obituary mentioned his work on financial corruption, but did not name any of his subjects. The man felt no satisfaction at the journalist's death, but also no grief. He felt the way one might feel reading about a storm in a distant country, aware of the fact, unmoved by it. He clipped the obituary and placed it in one of his notebooks, not as a trophy but as a marker, evidence that even witnesses eventually disappear. That night he dreamed about the journalist for the first time, and in the dream, they were sitting across from each other in an empty room, and neither of them could remember why they were there. The 5th year was the year his daughter asked him what he used to do. She was 8 now, old enough to notice the absence of any explanation for his presence in the house. He was in the garden. He had started spending afternoons there, sitting on a bench near the overgrown roses, and she approached him with the directness children use before they learn to be polite. He considered lying. He considered refusing to answer. Instead, he told her the truth, or a version of it, that he had been in business, that the business had ended, and that now he did not do much of anything. She processed this with a serious expression, and then asked if he had been good at it. He said he supposed he had been. She nodded and ran off to play, satisfied with this, and he sat in the garden feeling more seen than he had felt in years, which was not comforting but terrifying. His wife's father died, leaving her a small inheritance. Not enough to be wealthy, but enough to be independent. The man understood what this meant before she said anything. She came to his room one evening, a rare visit, almost ceremonial in its formality, and told him she was taking the children to her sister's house in the country for an extended stay. She did not ask him to come. She did not forbid him to come. She simply informed him of the plan, as one might inform a tenant of repairs. He nodded. She left. A week later, the house was empty except for him and the housekeeper, and the silence was so complete it felt like a presence. He thought about leaving, not dying. He was too tired for the drama of that, but simply walking away from the house and not returning. He fantasized about it in detail, packing a single bag, boarding a train to a city he had never visited, taking a room under a different name, starting again with nothing and no one. But the fantasy dissolved when he tried to imagine what he would do in that new city, with that new name. He had no skills except persuasion, and persuasion required a will he no longer possessed. He would end up exactly where he was, except in a smaller room, with shabbier furniture, and without even the ghost of a family to haunt. So he stayed. The housekeeper left, not because of anything he did, but because she was offered a position in a grander household. She gave him 2 weeks' notice and spent those 2 weeks teaching him how to make tea and toast, as if he were a child learning to feed himself. On her last day, she stood in the doorway and told him to take care of himself, and her tone suggested she did not expect him to succeed. He thanked her. She nodded and left, and then he was alone in the house, truly alone, for the first time in his life. The silence was not peaceful. It was geological, the silence of caves and abandoned places, the silence that precedes collapse. He began selling things, not the furniture that belonged to his wife, but his own possessions, the remnants of the person he had been, his good coats, his watches, his books. He sold them to second-hand dealers who did not ask questions and paid in cash he did not need but accumulated anyway, as if money were still meaningful. He kept only his notebooks. He read them sometimes in the evenings, trying to recognize himself in the handwriting, in the cold descriptions of methods and outcomes. He could not. The person who had written those pages was as distant as a historical figure, someone he had read about but never met. Winter arrived early. The house, without a full household to heat it, became cold. He moved his belongings into the kitchen, the warmest room, and slept near the stove. He ate simply, bread, cheese, soup he made in a pot he barely cleaned. He stopped shaving entirely. His beard grew long and tangled. His hair, uncut, fell past his collar. He looked, by now, like a vagrant, like someone who had wandered in from the streets and refused to leave, which, in a sense, was true. He was a vagrant in his own life, occupying it without permission, without purpose, waiting for someone to notice and evict him. But no one came. No one noticed. The city had forgotten him completely, and the forgetting was so thorough it felt like a kind of success. His wife returned in the spring without warning. He was sitting in the kitchen when she opened the door, and the expression on her face when she saw him, shock, horror, something close to grief, told him what he must look like. She did not speak to him immediately. She walked through the house, cataloging the damage, the dust, the disorder. the smell of neglect. Then she returned to the kitchen and sat across from him and said, very quietly, that this could not continue. He agreed. She asked what he intended to do. He said he did not know. She covered her face with her hands and sat that way for a long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady, and she told him she was not taking him to the country with them, but she would not leave him here alone. She had hired a nurse, someone to check on him, to ensure he ate and bathed and did not simply vanish into the house like a stain. The nurse was an older woman, pragmatic and unsentimental. She came 3 times a week, cooked meals he did not want, cleaned rooms he did not use, and spoke to him with the brisk kindness one might use on a confused child. He resented her at first, then became dependent on her visits, not for the care, but for the proof that time was still passing, that days still had structure. She did not ask about his past. She treated him as a present tense problem, a man who needed to eat, to sleep, to move through the basic rituals of survival. It was the closest he had come to peace in years. His son turned 5. The man received a letter from his wife, brief and factual, informing him of this and including a drawing the boy had made. A house with smoke coming from the chimney, figures in the windows, a sun in the corner. The man was not in the drawing. He was not sure if this was an oversight or an acknowledgement of reality. He pinned the drawing to the wall in the kitchen where he could see it while he ate, and sometimes he would stare at it, trying to feel what a father should feel and feeling only a distant curiosity, as if the drawing were a document from someone else's life. The young banker died. The man read about it in the newspaper the nurse brought. A carriage accident, sudden and pointless. The obituary was long and laudatory, filled with praise for his contributions to the financial sector, his integrity, his vision. The man read it twice, searching for irony, and found none. The banker had been genuine, or at least as genuine as anyone could be in that world. The man felt something close to grief, not for the banker, but for the fact that grief was still possible, that he had not yet become completely numb. He attended the funeral, standing in the back, unrecognized in his shabby coat and wild beard, and when it was over, he walked home slowly, feeling more like a ghost than ever. He began dreaming about his ventures, but in the dreams, they were real. The mines produced ore, the ships carried actual cargo, the factories hummed with machinery. In the dreams, he was competent and successful, and people respected him without question, and his wife smiled at him across dinner tables, and his children ran to greet him when he came home. The dreams were so vivid that waking became unbearable. The return to the cold kitchen and the empty house of violence he experienced each morning. He started sleeping longer, sometimes 16 hours a day, just to extend the time in the dreams and delay the return to reality. The nurse scolded him for this. He ignored her. His wife wrote again. The children were thriving, she said. His daughter was reading above her level. His son had developed an interest in drawing. The new baby was walking. The country air agreed with them. She did not ask how he was. She did not invite him to visit. The letter was simply a report, the kind one might send to a distant relative or a legal guardian. He did not respond. He placed the letter with the others in a drawer he rarely opened. That night, he dreamed he was walking through a city made entirely of paper, buildings and streets, and people all constructed from ledgers and contracts and letters. And as he walked, the paper began to burn, slowly at first, then all at once, and he woke to the smell of smoke and realized he had left the stove burning all night. He extinguished it and sat in the dark kitchen, his heart racing, grateful for the mistake because it had interrupted the dream before the fire consumed him too. The 6th year was the year he stopped dreaming, not gradually, but suddenly, as if some mechanism in his mind had exhausted itself and shut down. He would sleep and wake with no memory of the interval, no images or narratives, just the blank space where dreams had been. The absence was disorienting at first, then comforting. Without dreams, sleep became purely functional, a maintenance routine, and waking lost its comparative horror. He existed in a single continuous present, without the interference of alternate versions of himself. It was, in its way, a kind of clarity. The nurse asked him one day if he had ever considered leaving the city, not to visit his family, she did not mention them, but simply to go somewhere else, to see something new. He said he had not. She pressed. Did he not want to see the ocean or the mountains or any of the things people traveled to see. He told her he had already seen everything he needed to see. She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, and they did not discuss it again. But he thought about her question for weeks, turning it over in his mind like a stone. What would it mean to want something? He could not remember. His beard had grown so long it reached his chest. The nurse suggested he cut it. He refused, not out of vanity, but because cutting it would require a decision, an act of self-determination, and he was no longer capable of those. The beard became a marker of time passing, a calendar written in hair. Sometimes he would pull at it absently, feeling its weight, surprised each time by how substantial it had become. It was the only part of him that seemed to be growing, accumulating, moving forward. The rest of him was static, a fixed point while the world revolved around him. He received a letter from his daughter, not delivered by his wife, but sent directly, in a child's careful handwriting. She was 9 now. The letter was short. She missed him. She hoped he was well. She had learned to play the piano. She signed it with a drawing of a flower. The man read the letter 20 times, searching for subtext, for accusation, for anything other than the simple affection it claimed to express. He found nothing. The letter was sincere. This was somehow worse than if it had been cruel. He wrote back, his first letter in years, a brief note telling her he was proud of her piano playing and that he missed her too. He mailed it before he could reconsider. The nurse, seeing the envelope, smiled in a way that made him feel exposed and ashamed. He began taking walks again, longer ones, venturing into parts of the city that were being rebuilt and expanded. New buildings rose where old ones had been torn down. The streets filled with people who had not been born when he had arrived in the capital. He was a relic, a ghost from an earlier era, wandering through a world that had no use for him. Sometimes younger men, clerks and businessmen, would pass him in the street, and he would search their faces for any sign of recognition, and find none. They did not know who he was. They did not know who anyone was. They were too busy becoming the next version of what he had been, making promises they could not keep, building empires from vapor, and he wanted to warn them but knew they would not listen, because he had not listened either. Winter came again. The 6th winter, or was it the 7th? He was losing track. The nurse mentioned that his wife had written to her, not to him, but to the nurse, inquiring about his health. The nurse had replied that he was stable, a word that could mean anything or nothing. The man asked if his wife had indicated any intention to visit. The nurse said no. The man nodded. That night he sat by the window in the kitchen and watched snow fall on the empty street, and he thought about his daughter's letter, about the flower she had drawn, and he wondered if she would remember him when she was older. Probably not. Probably he would become a vague shape in her memory, a figure associated with absence rather than presence, a name her mother mentioned occasionally with a certain careful tone. He decided this was preferable to the alternative, that she remember him clearly and judge him accurately. Some erasures were mercy. The 7th year was the year of small surrenders. He stopped bathing regularly. The nurse scolded him, but her heart was not in it. She had been caring for him long enough to recognize which battles were worth fighting. He stopped reading newspapers. The world continued without his observation, and his observation had never affected it anyway. He stopped counting the days. Time became a texture rather than a sequence, something he moved through without measuring. The only markers were the nurse's visits, the changing light through the kitchen window, the arrival of letters from his daughter, which came every few months, each one slightly longer, slightly more articulate than the last. His son, he learned from one of these letters, had started school. His youngest daughter was speaking in full sentences. His wife had taken up painting. The family existed without him, functioned without him, thrived without him. This should have brought relief. He had not destroyed them, had not contaminated them with his failure, but instead, it brought a hollow ache, the knowledge that he was not necessary, had never been necessary, that his absence was not a wound, but a space that had healed over so smoothly, no scar remained. He tried once to reconstruct the moment when everything had started. Was it the first lie? The first investment? The first time someone had believed him without question? He could not locate a beginning. It felt as though he had been born into the deception, had never existed outside of it, and now that the deception was over, he simply had no self left to return to. He mentioned this to the nurse, and she, to her credit, did not dismiss it. She said that people were always more than one thing, and that maybe he needed to find the other things. But what if there were no other things? What if the lies had not been a disguise but the whole structure, and removing them left only air? His wife wrote to him directly for the first time in 2 years. The letter was formal, almost legal in its tone. She wanted to know his intentions regarding the house. Did he wish to remain there indefinitely? Should she arrange alternative accommodations? She was not cruel, merely practical. The house was an asset, and assets needed to be managed. He wrote back that he would leave if she wished. She replied that she did not wish that, but that she needed to understand what he intended to do. He had no answer. He did not intend to do anything. Intention required a future, and he had none. He stopped responding to her letters, and she stopped sending them, and the silence between them became permanent. One afternoon, returning from a walk, he found a man standing outside his house. Not an official or a creditor, those had stopped coming years ago, but someone shabbier, more desperate. The man introduced himself as a journalist, working on a book about financial speculation in the previous decades. He had questions. Would the man consent to an interview? The man said no. The journalist persisted, even anonymously, even just to provide context. The man repeated his refusal. The journalist left a card, said to contact him if he changed his mind. The man burned the card in the stove. But that night, he lay awake, imagining the book, imagining his story told from the outside, and he wondered if the journalist would get it right, or if anyone could, or if getting it right was even possible when the person who had lived it could no longer recognize himself in the narrative. His beard had grown past his stomach. It was gray now, almost white, and when he caught sight of himself in windows or mirrors, he saw an old man, though he was not yet 50. The nurse had stopped suggesting he cut it. She had accepted, as he had accepted, that he was no longer participating in the theater of self-presentation. He existed, that was all. He occupied space, consumed food, generated waste, but these were biological functions, not choices. He had become a process rather than a person, and the distinction no longer troubled him. Trouble required caring, and caring required a self, and he was no longer sure he had one of those. The 8th year was the year his oldest daughter visited. She came without warning, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in summer. The nurse let her in, and she stood in the doorway of the kitchen where he spent his days, and they looked at each other across a distance that was not only spatial. She was 12 now, nearly a young woman with her mother's eyes and something in her posture that suggested steel. She asked if she could sit. He nodded. She sat. They were silent for a long time. Finally, she asked why he had stopped writing to her. He had no answer that would not sound like an excuse. She asked if he still thought about them. He said yes, though he was not sure it was true. She asked if he was happy. He almost laughed, but he knew that would be cruel, so he simply said no. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Then she stood, said she was glad to see him, and left. The entire visit lasted perhaps 10 minutes. It was the most honest conversation he had had in years. After she left, he sat in the kitchen and wept for the first time since the collapse. Not dramatically, not with any catharsis, but quietly, the way an old building settles, small cracks appearing in plaster, dust falling from ceiling beams. He wept because his daughter had come, and because she had left, and because both of those things were exactly what should have happened, and there was no injustice in it, only consequence. The nurse, arriving an hour later, found him with his face in his hands, and she did not ask what was wrong. She simply made tea and sat with him until the crying stopped, and then she went about her work as if nothing had happened, which was perhaps the greatest kindness she could have offered. He began writing again, but not about his ventures. Instead, he wrote letters to his children that he would never send. Letters explaining himself, his choices, the person he had been before he became what he became. The letters were long and rambling, without structure or coherence, the written equivalent of thinking aloud. He filled notebooks with these letters, addressing them to his daughter, his son, his youngest daughter who had never known him at all. He wrote about his parents, his childhood, the small failures that had preceded the large ones. He wrote about the first time he had lied successfully, the thrill of it, the ease. He wrote about meeting their mother, about the moment he realized she knew what he was, and chose him anyway. He wrote until his hand cramped, and then he would rest and write more. The letters accumulated in a drawer alongside the notebooks about his business methods. Together they formed an archive of a life that no one would ever read. His son's letters had stopped coming. Not abruptly, they had simply tapered off. from monthly to biannual to nothing. The man did not blame him. What was there to say to a father who was less a person than an absence, a gap in family photographs, a name invoked only to explain why someone was not present? His youngest daughter had never written at all. She had been a baby when he had last held her, and babies do not remember. She would grow up knowing him only as a fact, something her mother and siblings referenced occasionally, a historical footnote in the family narrative. This was fine. This was probably better. Children deserved fathers who could offer something beyond regret. The nurse announced she was retiring. Not immediately. She would work through the end of the year. But she was getting older. Her back hurt. She wanted to live with her daughter in a town by the sea. She told him this with genuine apology, as if she were abandoning him, which in a sense she was. He told her he understood. She promised to find a replacement. He told her not to bother. She protested. He needed someone to check on him, to ensure he was eating. He said he would manage. She looked skeptical but did not argue. They both knew what he meant. Without her visits, he would simply let the routine dissolve, and the dissolving would take him with it. And that was fine. She cried, which surprised him. He had not realized she cared. He thanked her for everything, and the gratitude was genuine, the first genuine emotion he had expressed in months, and it exhausted him. The nurse left in December. She hugged him before she went. This woman who had bathed him and fed him and tolerated him without judgment, and he held her awkwardly, not sure where to put his hands, not sure what the gesture meant. Then she was gone, and the house was empty again, and the silence was total. He had enough food for a week, maybe 2. After that, he would need to venture out, to purchase supplies, to participate in the mechanics of survival. He thought about this without urgency. The question was not whether he could survive, but whether he wanted to. The answer was unclear. He decided to wait and see what happened. Decision-making had never been his strength anyway. The 9th year began without the nurse and ended without ceremony. He did not starve. Survival, it turned out, required less effort than he had imagined. He ate bread and cheese and occasionally soup he made from vegetables he bought from a vendor who did not ask questions. He slept when he was tired and woke when he was not. He walked sometimes, though less frequently than before, and only at night, when the streets were empty and the darkness made him feel less visible. He did not bathe. He did not cut his hair or beard. He did not write letters or read newspapers or track the passage of time. He simply existed, a biological process, a body going through motions without a pilot. Sometimes he thought about dying, not as a decision, but as a fact that would eventually occur. He imagined his body being found, probably by a landlord or creditor, weeks or months after the fact. He imagined the brief flurry of bureaucracy, the notices sent to his wife, the quiet disposal, the small paragraph in a newspaper that no one would read. He imagined his children learning of his death and feeling, what? Grief? Relief? The complicated knot of emotions that comes when someone who was never fully present becomes fully absent. He hoped for relief, not for his sake but for theirs. Grief was a luxury, a response to loss, and you could not lose what you had never properly had. His daughter wrote one final time. She was 14 now, the letter said. She was doing well in school. She had decided to study mathematics. She wanted him to know that she did not hate him, that she understood, or was trying to understand, that people were complicated, and that families were complicated, and that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was step away. She hoped he was taking care of himself. She hoped he was finding some measure of peace. She signed the letter with her name. No drawing this time, just her name in careful script. The man read the letter sitting at the kitchen table, and when he finished, he folded it precisely and placed it in his pocket, and carried it with him for weeks until the paper wore soft and the ink began to smudge. He never wrote back. What could he say that would not be a burden or a lie? He began to forget things. Not dramatically. He did not wander the streets confused or fail to recognize his own house, but details eroded. The names of people he had known, the year he had married, the exact sequence of events that had led to the collapse. His past became vague, a story he had heard once but could not quite recall. Sometimes he would try to remember specific moments, the day he arrived in the capital, the first successful lie, the birth of his children, and find only gaps, absences where memories should have been. This should have frightened him, but it felt instead like relief, the slow unburdening of a life that had become too heavy to carry. One night, walking past the building where he had once kept his office, he noticed it had been converted into apartments. Lights glowed in the windows. He could see people moving inside, living their lives, and the sight was so ordinary, so completely disconnected from the empire he had briefly built there, that he laughed aloud. The laughter startled him. It had been so long since he had made that sound. A woman walking past gave him a wide berth, mistaking him for a madman, which perhaps he was. He continued walking, still laughing quietly, and the laughter turned into crying, and the crying subsided into breathing, and he stood on a corner he did not recognize, in a city that had forgotten him, and he thought, this is what it means to be erased, not to die, but to become so irrelevant that your presence and absence are indistinguishable. Winter came. His 9th, or 10th, or 15th, he had lost count. The cold was brutal, and the house, unheated except for the kitchen stove, became uninhabitable. He thought about writing to his wife, asking for help, but pride or inertia stopped him. Instead, he moved his things, his few remaining possessions, into the kitchen and lived there entirely, sleeping near the stove, eating at the small table, spending his days in a space barely larger than a cell. It was, in a way, appropriate. He had reduced himself to the minimum, to the smallest possible version of existence, and even that felt excessive, more than he deserved or could justify. The final year was not a year but a season, then a month, then a day. Time had collapsed into immediate experience. No past or future, only the eternal present of waking and walking and returning to the kitchen, where he had arranged his life into the smallest possible circumference. He was no longer sure how old he was. 50? 60? His body felt ancient, but bodies lie. They exaggerate. They complain. He had stopped trusting physical sensation as a marker of anything meaningful. He wrote one last letter. Not to his family, he had exhausted that avenue, but to the young banker who had died years ago. He knew the letter would never be read, that it was an exercise in futility, but futility was the only exercise left to him. He wrote about the ventures, about the illusions, about the moment he had realized the banker knew and had chosen silence. He wrote that he understood now what the banker had understood then, that all of it was theater, and the only difference between fraud and legitimacy was scale and consensus. He wrote that he was not apologizing because apology implied regret, and regret implied a belief in alternative outcomes, and he no longer believed in alternatives. Things happened the way they happened. That was all. He signed the letter, addressed the envelope to a grave he had never visited, and placed it in a drawer with all the others. His daughter came one last time, though he did not know it would be the last. She was 16, nearly grown, with a seriousness that reminded him of her mother. She brought food, actual food, bread and meat and fruit, and she cooked it in his kitchen while he sat and watched. Too tired to be ashamed of his helplessness, they ate together in silence. When they finished, she asked him a question. Did he ever regret it? Not the specific lies, but the whole architecture of it, the decision to build a life on foundations that could not hold. He thought for a long time. Finally, he said he regretted the waste. Not moral waste, but the waste of time and effort, the exhaustion of maintaining something that was always going to collapse. She nodded. She said she had been angry at him for years, but that the anger had passed, and what remained was just sadness, and that sadness was easier to live with. She kissed his forehead before she left, the gesture so startling he almost pulled away. Then she was gone, and he sat in the kitchen, touching the place her lips had touched, the warmth fading into memory. He stopped eating, not as a decision, more as a forgetting. The bread went stale on the table. The cheese hardened. He drank water from the tap, but did not think to supplement it with food. And after a few days, the body began the process of shutting down, slowly, without drama. He felt weak, but not uncomfortable. Hunger became abstract, a fact he observed, but did not experience. He slept more, 16 hours, then 20, time dissolving into a series of brief wakings where he would register light or darkness and then return to sleep. In one of these wakings, he realized he was dying. The realization was calm, almost curious. So this is how it happens, he thought, not with a bang, but with a gradual dimming, a slow fade to black. His wife arrived on a Thursday. He had been unconscious for 2 days. She found him on the floor of the kitchen, his breathing shallow, his pulse thready. She did not panic. She sent for a doctor, who arrived too late to do much besides confirm what was already obvious. She sat with him while he died, holding his hand. This woman who had known him and married him and lived beside him and raised his children and tolerated his collapse with a grace he had never deserved. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. When his breathing stopped, she closed his eyes and sat for a while longer. And then she stood and began the practical work of ending. The arrangements, the notices, the small obituary that would say nothing of substance. Just dates and survivors and the barest facts. At the funeral, attended by his wife, his children, and no one else, his oldest daughter read from a letter she had written. She spoke about absence and presence, about the shapes people leave behind, about the way we carry our parents inside us, whether we want to or not. She did not say she loved him. She did not say she forgave him. She said that he had been part of her story and that she was choosing to remember him not as a villain or a victim, but as a person who had been overwhelmed by his own choices, and that there was a kind of tragedy in that, and tragedy deserved acknowledgement, if not absolution. Her voice did not waver. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in her pocket, the same pocket where her father had carried her last letter to him. Though she did not know this, they buried him in a small plot with a simple stone that bore his name and nothing else. By the next season, the grass had grown over, and visitors were rare, then non-existent. The forgetting, which had begun years earlier, was now complete. Maybe you're listening to this in a quiet room, or on a walk where the world feels larger than your thoughts, or in some in-between moment where the day has not yet decided what it wants to be. Stories like this, the ones that don't resolve, that don't offer comfort or clarity, they stay with you in strange ways, not as lessons, but as echoes. The man in this story vanished not because he was erased by others, but because he erased himself, slowly, methodically, until there was nothing left to remember. That's a different kind of ending than most stories offer. It's not clean, it's not satisfying, but maybe it's true in a way that comfort never is. If you've stayed with this story to the end, if you've let it sit with you even when it was difficult, thank you. These are the stories we need, the quiet ones, the unresolved ones, the ones that trust you to sit with discomfort rather than offering you easy exits. If you want more stories like this, stories that don't look away, consider subscribing. Not because there's a lesson or a moral waiting at the end, but because sometimes the act of listening, really listening, is its own kind of resolution. Wherever you are right now, whatever brought you here, I hope you carry something from this with you. Not inspiration, not hope, just the knowledge that some lives unfold quietly, without applause or condemnation, and that bearing witness to them matters. Thank you for listening. Come back when you're ready.